Thrones of Decay gives us new units for the Empire, Dwarfs, and Nurgle. What are they? What do they do? Let's have a look. First up, Elspeth von Draken, the new legendary lord for the Empire, bringing a slightly darker tone, coming with death magic, although she's dressed like she just fell out the clown bin. But she's your usual wizard in terms of stats. She's a bit better in the melee than most wizards, but with only 20 armor, she'll probably want to avoid it when she's on foot at least. Typical wizard weapon strength at 320, but hey, it's armor piercing. But of course, she comes with the death magic. Now, I was trying to think of a way to show you the abilities a bit better in these videos, so I'm just going to scroll over them, pause the video if you want to read them properly. I'm not going to go over all of them. That one there, though, Death's Timekeeper, was pretty nice. It does damage to an enemy, but also heals her. She also has the Living Darkness ability, which gives her a physical resistance and removes the magical weapons traits of nearby enemies. So she has quite a few defensive abilities to help keep herself alive, but also a few damage ones as well. And as for mounts, she can get a steed mount, which will be her early game mount, but you will obviously want to work your way up to her unique dragon Carmine, who comes with all the dragony benefits, such as being able to fly around, more armor, more weapon strength, still armor piercing, a breath attack as well, and it's the first dragon for the Empire faction, so a pretty nice addition for them. Next, we have a new generic lord choice, the Master Engineer. His combat stats are nothing to write home about, and with his wizard level weapon strength, with no armor piercing, he'll want to avoid melee most of the time when he's on foot anyway, but that's so he can make the most of his ranged attack, which is pretty short range at only 115, but it's a frickin' grenade launcher, so he can blow up the crowds very nicely with that. The Master Engineer has a lot of useful abilities though, one able to restock the ammunition of nearby friendly units, the Pigeon Bomb, which is a bombardment ability, quite literally bringing pigeons with bombs. You're never going to look at pigeons the same after this. And overall, the Master Engineer is the kind of lord that wants to sit back with the ranged troops and support them, buff them up, whilst doing his own ranged attacks. He can get this pretty cool new mount as well, the Mechanical Steed. It provides more armor, speed, and charge bonus, which is very nice. But if you like your lord mounted atop more metal, then why not pop him in a steam tank? Because that's one of his mount options as well. This of course gives him a big long-range artillery type attack and makes him a lot tougher and harder to kill. So steam tanks now a lord option for the Empire. Sigmar will be very pleased. On to the heroes, and we have a legendary hero in Theodore Bruckner. He has beefy combat stats, lots of armor on, good melee attack, melee defense, big weapon strength, although not armor piercing. So on foot, you'll probably want to have him fighting in lesser armored crowds. For his abilities, he has a mixture of debuffs to the enemies, but also buffs for himself, for his weapon strength, for his defenses. He also has a debuff to enemy leadership when he's nearby as well, and if he dies, he'll explode, taking a bunch of enemies with him in theory. So he's equipped to deal with many kind of situations. He can crowd fight, he can probably take on some other lords and heroes, but he's mainly going to want to do that atop his unique Mount Reaper. This big old demigriff gives him extra armor, more speed, more damage output from the charge bonus, and most importantly, armor piercing damage. So a pretty simple hero, but strong and reliable overall, and versatile enough to play different roles pretty well. I also like that he doesn't have a helmet on foot, but he does when he's on the demigriff. A nice touch. And then we have the Engineer Hero. Very similar to the Master Engineer Lord, not too great in melee, but not terrible. His ranged attack is quite different though, as it is much longer range and big armor-piercing damage. So a bit more of a sniper, going to be good for picking off those larger single entities. So good if you want a sniper character, or if you want the benefits of the Master Engineer, but you don't want to bring him as the Lord, you can bring the hero and still get those benefits to your ranged units. For abilities, he has Restock and Master of Ballistics, the same as the Master Engineer, but he has this magic missile, Mercurial Shot, which is pretty good on the armor piercing and explosive damage, so good for firing into strong crowds. You can also go on the Steed or Mechanical Steed mounts. Now into the units. First of all, Grundel's Defenders. These are spearmen with shields, a Regiment of Renown version. Overall, pretty much the same unit, slightly boosted stats, except they have one special ability, Rear Guardian. You know how the Guardian trait works with Lords and Heroes, where it gives them a 15% physical resistance? Well, they do that, but for war machines and artillery. So they can help keep those units alive, perhaps staying back, protecting things like cannons and Hellstorm rocket batteries that can't really defend themselves, or they could travel around with more mobile artillery like steam tanks. So pretty unique in its usage, but also very handy in the right situation. And then we have Nuln Ironsides. Now these are basically the same as Empire handgunners, except you can think of them as more highly trained. They're not terrible in melee, but not fantastic either. They have the same range as handgunners, but twice the missile strength. and they have an ability called Black Powder Discipline, which will increase their accuracy and reload skill, but only after they've been stood still for 10 seconds. So if you can keep these boys protected and stood still, they will do an absolute ton of damage very quickly, and that's great for many purposes: blasting infantry, blasting cavalry, monsters, large lords and heroes, whatever. So while similar in purpose to the handgunners, they're just going to do that job way better. And then we have another new ranged unit, the Hochland Long Rifles. You know how Skaven Jezzails or Cathay Crane Gunners work? Well, these are basically the Empire's version of those. Very long range at 260, armor-piercing missile, very strong. They do have snipe as well, which means they can fire and they won't be discovered. However, they don't have stalk, which means they won't be hidden, just stood out in the open field. They actually have to hide somewhere. So plonk them in the trees and they'll be able to snipe from there without revealing their position, although, you can see where the projectile comes from, but whatever, it'll potentially help them stay alive a little bit better. A very nice addition for the Empire, although do look after them because they are going to be terrible in melee. And then there's the Regiment of Renown version of those, the Herrig Jägerkorps. So pretty much the same unit, just with some stat boosts, a little more damage. They can reduce missile block chance as well on their missile strength. They have snipe as well, and the Black Powder Discipline trait as seen on the other unit, which gives them more accuracy and reload time when they've been stood still for 10 seconds. So these two units going to be great for picking off stronger enemy units. This one is going to be especially good for taking out anything with a big shield, a silver shield. Obviously you can take down large really well with these. Artillery usually goes down pretty quick to these kind of units as well. So these two units really round out the Empire's ranged game very well. And then we have a new cavalry, the Knights of the Black Rose, bringing a proper melee cavalry to the Empire. So most of the Empire's cavalry is shock cavalry, those that are designed for charging. They've got big charge bonuses, but they have low melee defense, so they're not good at staying in prolonged combat. Well, that's what these boys are for. They have really good melee defense, not as big of a charge bonus, lots of armor, shield. So this is a cavalry you can kind of use as a front line if you want to, charging into the preferably lightly armored enemy front line and just leaving them there and letting them go to town. Although you will benefit from cycle charging them every now and again, but you don't need to as much as you do with, say, Empire Knights or Reichsguard. They're also immune to psychology, although I'm kind of surprised they don't cause fear actually, given their spooky appearance, but a decent complement to the already strong Empire Cav lineup. And then we have the Steam Tank Volley Gun. This is basically a steam tank, as you know and love, but with much greater damage output, albeit with considerably shorter range. So these can be great used as artillery pieces, first of all doing damage before the enemy arrives, but when they do, you can continue staying out the way and doing damage, or you can charge in and run over people, because, you're a tank. But overall, it should be more damage output in a shorter space of time, just a shorter range artillery. And then we have the big old land ship, bringing naval combat to Warhammer 3 finally. The Vampire Coast are going to be furious they didn't think of this first. This thing basically is a big damage-dealing chariot. It's got guns all over it, they're going to be firing at all times, it does armor-piercing melee damage, a big charge bonus of 80, and the biggest giveaway that it's supposed to be a chariot and keep moving at all times is its pathetic 18 melee defense. So yeah, charge this thing around all over the place. It causes fear as well, which is going to be helpful. The Empire don't have a lot of that. It's not terribly quick, but it does have an ability that can seriously speed it up at the expense of its turning speed. So as long as you only travel in straight lines, you'll be absolutely fine. It also blows up and does damage if it dies, so just a big damage-dealing powerhouse of a chariot, basically. And then there's the Regiment of Renown version, the Wonder of the Age. Pretty much the same deal, except it has a mortar on it, so it'll be able to do a bit of mortar fire as it goes, and the men in it have grenade launchers rather than repeater rifles, so a lot more damage output coming from this thing. Still got a cannon on the front of it as well. So again, absolute damage powerhouse chariot. If you charge it through the enemy army, it's just going to do a ton of work. Although, as I say, don't leave these in prolonged combat, don't leave them still, they will get beaten up very quick with their low melee defense. They're also a big target for missiles as well, of course, so do be a bit careful if you do want to keep them alive, or if you want to sacrifice them at the end and let them blow up and kill stuff, that's a good option too, albeit an expensive one. But overall, some very, very nice additions for the Empire roster, I think. Into the Nurgle boys, starting with Tamakan, the Maggot Lord. This big boy has a lot of weapon strength, armor piercing, and anti-large as well. So just a big melee powerhouse that wants to hunt down the large enemies. He has a mix of offensive and defensive abilities, but his most notable is Feast of the Maggot Lord, which, when he hits 0 health and basically dies, he actually won't die and won't be able to die for the next 28 seconds, instead doing direct damage to a nearby lord or hero and stealing their health and basically healing himself, so potentially saving him from dying. but it'll only activate if there's a lord or hero nearby when he hits that 0 HP. So a very cool ability that can make him difficult to kill off, especially if you plonk him on Bubolus, his toad dragon mount. Obviously a big massive single entity beast to charge around, although do note that this changes him from anti-large over to anti-infantry, so if you want Tamakan to be anti-large you will have to keep him on foot, otherwise you can destroy all the infantry when he's on his mount, and he also gets a magic missile breath attack as well. So a very tough and quite versatile lord. And then we have Epidemius, who is not technically part of the DLC, he's actually free LC, but we'll put him in here anyway. Now Epidemius is actually more of a support lord, although his stats aren't too bad at all. He can go into melee and do some good work, but he's not going to shine there. He does have some nice armor piercing weapon strength though, so he can take on some tougher targets. And do note the unit card I'm showing you here with 28 speed is his on foot speed. He's obviously on his mount here, which does make him a little bit faster. Overall, he's the kind of support lord that wants to be in there alongside the boys fighting, his boys mainly being plague bearers, and he can actually summon a unit of exalted plague bearers. His other abilities will buff up his troops, making them tougher, harder to kill, maybe increase their damage or debuff the enemy. So overall, just a very nice frontline lord who wants to work together with his army rather than being a more solo lord that'll just run off whenever when needed. And then we've got the Chaos Lord of Nurgle, another new generic lord. This one being very tanky, he's got a ton of armor, ton of melee defense, a big silver shield, weapon strength, not armor piercing though, which is always a bit of a letdown. Should be great though for taking on more lightly armored crowds or lightly armored lords and heroes. For his abilities, he has a lot of defensive stuff, a lot of melee damage reflection, so further playing into that tank role. If you want a reliable lord that won't easily die on you, this might be your guy. He can also go on a steed, chariot, or rot beast mount. What's a rot beast, I hear you cry? Well, it's actually one of these that Kazakh the Befouled is on. This handsome chap is a new legendary hero for Nurgle. Pretty decent stats, although not the biggest weapon strength in the land. It is armor piercing and anti-infantry though, and he does have a pretty chunky charge bonus to beef his damage up with as well. And he's not going to be the easiest to kill because he does have regeneration too. He's got some nice abilities with Sword of Filth. This reduces melee defense and armor of all nearby enemies, or up to 5 nearby enemies. And his Befouled Charge ability is very nice. This will remove the charge defense of enemy units, so you can now just absolutely run through spearmen without them ruining your charge bonus. And with that in mind, I think he's the kind of hero that wants to go around with cavalry, making the most of that ability, taking out those anti-large units. And then we have a generic hero, the Chaos Sorcerer of Nurgle, with the Death or Nurgle magic. Pretty much your standard Chaos Wizard who's pretty tough in the melee, can survive pretty well, but isn't going to do a ton of damage. Obviously there to bring the magic spells along, and while he doesn't have a ton in the way of abilities, he can have a steed, rot beast, or Chaos War Shrine mount. So basically a hero version of the Chaos Sorcerer Lord that Nurgle already has. Potentially a solid choice if you have a melee lord like Tamakan and you want to bring the magic and maybe the support of one of those Chaos War Shrines. Now on to the infantry, first up with the Pestigors. These nasty ass goats don't look like the toughest in the world with only 25 armor and 20 melee defense, but they have a lot of HP, so they're going to be tougher than they look. And they also have pretty good leadership for a cheaper unit, and armor piercing, which is also nice on a cheaper unit. And although Nurgle already has cheap armor piercing in Marauder Great Weapons, these offer you a little bit extra foot speed and vanguard deployment, so they can be a little bit more on the sneaky side. They also have an ability that will slow the enemy by 75% speed if they rout them, and nearby enemies as well, so they'll be able to chase down enemies that they rout and then just absolutely kill them off. And not forgetting as well that they have poison like all Nurgle units, which is again going to slow the enemy by another 15%, so yeah, pretty nasty. Then we have the Plague Ogres, bringing some bigger boys to the Nurgle roster. These are pretty much man-eater ogres from the Ogre Kingdoms, just with the Nurgly twists of having a little extra HP and poison, but overall they're just bringing that heavy mass and anti-infantry killing power. And then there's the Plague Ogres with great weapons. Pretty much the same idea as everything I just said. These are basically man-eaters, and with great weapons they are anti-large, and that actually is pretty huge for Nurgle, because one of the big weaknesses of Nurgle's roster all this time is that they haven't really had any great or reliable anti-large units, and with no missile units it's very difficult for Nurgle to deal with large stuff sometimes. So yeah, this is a pretty huge addition for Nurgle to finally have a reliable anti-large unit, albeit a bit of an expensive one. I expect to see these in every Nurgle army though. And then we've got some more head bonking power with the Bile Trolls. Big armor piercing damage, pretty much your normal troll to be honest, just with those Nurgly twists, got the regeneration. They do have an ability that reduces nearby enemy melee defense by 6. These pretty much offer you the same thing that the Plague Ogres do, just for a little bit cheaper and not quite as good. The usual troll experience really. And then we have the Rot Knights, another huge addition for the Nurgle roster for the reasons I said just now, because these are an anti-large cavalry. So again, filling that hole in Nurgle's roster very well. They're armor piercing as well. Stats overall, very nice. They're very tough. They'll have more HP. They got a lot of armor. They got more melee defense than melee attack. And they have regeneration. So they're going to be pretty hard to kill and still able to put out that damage. They could be one of the new top tier anti-large cavalries. And then there's the Regiment of Renown version, the Rotting Riders, who might look very similar, but they do actually have more kind of green mankiness on their armor than the normal version. But these are pretty much the same deal. They now have magical attacks, and they have an ability giving them a 15% damage resistance, while their leadership is basically just not broken. So they're going to be even harder to kill, but otherwise the same as the normal version. A little bit more specific in their targeting, perhaps, with that magical damage. They can go after things with physical resistances. But yeah, these Rot Beast units, very big for the Nurgle roster. And lastly, to the biggest boy, the Toad Dragon. He's not quite as big as a Dreadsaurian, but he's not far off. This thing, a big anti-infantry killer, huge weapon strength, anti-infantry bonus, lots of health, poison, all the good stuff. Does have the magic missile breath attack as well. So overall, just a big problem for the enemy to deal with, a big damage soak that can absorb a lot of punishment, draw a lot of fire, which will help protect other units. So overall, just your big problematic damage dealer type single entity that can just walk all over the enemy army wherever it wants, whenever it wants, however it wants. And with that, we conclude the Nurgle units, bringing us to finally onto the Dawi then, with new legendary lord Malachi Makaisen. Now, despite being a slayer, he's actually a missile specialist, and while his stats look okay for melee, he generally doesn't do great there with the lack of armor, so he's a lord that wants to stay out the way using his ranged attack. It's very strong, it's got good range, great for sniping down those larger foes. He doesn't have any mount options, so you will have to be a bit careful with him on foot. Overall, he's more of a support lord with his abilities. He's got some big damage boosts for missile units. He's also got a magic missile for himself. He can also heal artillery and war machines, which is pretty nice. So the kind of lord that wants to sit in the backline with other missiles and artillery, buffing them up, helping them do tons of damage while sniping away himself. So it brings something different to the Dawi table in terms of lords with a ranged lord, but he's very powerful when teamed up with the right missiles and artillery. If you were hoping for a melee Slayer Lord, well, you've got the Demon Slayer for that. He's exactly what you'd expect, a full-on melee Lord, big melee attack, big weapon strength, anti-large, so he's going to want to hunt down the big boys. Obviously, armor is non-existent, so toughness is a bit of an issue, but he does have a bronze shield, so he can block some missiles, and by bronze shield, I obviously mean his beard. For his abilities, he has a debuff, he has some buffs of various kinds for himself and for others, but most notably, he has the Glorious Death ability, which will prevent him and other slayers around him from dying for 40 seconds. So that's very nice if used at the right moment, like going after a big, strong enemy with a group of slayers. You can all take him down without taking any deaths at all. And it also works well with this ability, which gives him a big damage boost if he fights a unit that has terror. Very nice. And for a new legendary hero, we've got Garagrim Iron Fist. More a slayer of human-sized things than big things, as he doesn't have anti-large, but he does have anti-infantry. He's got magical attacks. So your usual kind of damage-dealing slayer. Just remember to throw him into the crowds of infantry rather than after the monsters or cavalry, especially as he has this ability, Hurricane of Death, a small vortex, so that's absolutely going to destroy a crowd. Good against armor as well. And then he just mostly has a whole bunch of damage boosts to boost himself up and maybe some friendlies. So if you need to kill enemy infantry, Garagrim is your guy. Just be careful if any large stuff comes after him. He'll still do okay there, but it's not really his forte, right? But it is the Dragon Slayer's forte, as he is your generic hero choice. He's anti-large, armor piercing, so if you want to take down the big boys and Gotrek isn't around, then this boy is your man dude guy bro. He's very similar to Garagrim in his abilities in that he's got a lot of damage boosts for beefing himself up, so he's basically the anti-large version of Garagrim, just not quite as strong overall. So great for hunting down enemy lords and heroes, single entities, any of the stronger large, probably his preferred target. Now onto some infantry, first up with the Doom Seekers. Stats-wise, they're like any other Slayer who have good melee attack, decent melee defense, but no armor, so they do have to be a bit careful around missiles, but these are your anti-infantry Slayers, the infantry killers, as opposed to other Slayers, the normal Slayers and the Giant Slayers basically, that are anti-large. So these are anti-infantry, they've got armor piercing so they can go after all manner of targets, they've got magical damage as well, so good against the demons and undead and such. And these boys are pretty much the toughest of the tough for the Dawi, as there is only 32 of them in the unit, but they have as much health as a full 80 unit of Slayers, so they're all sturdy boys. They also have the Whirlwind Vortex ability, like Garagrim does, and also the Ward that gives them a 20% physical resistance, increasing with the more stuff they kill. And if all that wasn't enough, they also have Vanguard deployment as well, so they can negate the power of some enemy missiles. Nice! And then we have the Regiment of Renown version of those, the Brotherhood of Grimnir. These are literally the same as the normal Doomseekers, the only difference seems to be that they have a slightly better Vortex attack, which just cools down a bit quicker so they can do it more often, but other than that, they are literally the same, just with some slightly better stat boost in melee attack and melee defense. So yeah, honestly, they're very nearly just the normal Doomseekers. And then we have Slayer Pirates, yarr! These are Slayers with a ranged attack, which is very nice, armor piercing, only short range though, as it's just a little pistol. They're actually not so good in melee as other Slayers, and because they only have a little bit of ammunition, use all that up first before you put them in melee, otherwise you're going to waste that ammo if they die, and you know, with zero armor, they will die. They can fire whilst moving though as well, which is always handy to have. So a nice option to bring some ranged power to a Slayer army, good for using up that strong missile ammo, and then getting them into maybe some lesser enemies, some chaffy stuff that they could quite easily beat up. And then we have the raw version, Longdrong Slayer Pirates. These once again are basically the same thing, just with some improved stats, and they have an ability called Dwarf Rum, which will reduce nearby enemy melee attack by 10, which is quite significant. So once you've used up their ammo, charge them in, have them work with other units that can benefit from that minus 10 melee attack of nearby enemies, and they could provide some good support for other units. Otherwise, again, just nice range damage dealing. If range damage dealing is really what you want to do though, then the new Thunderers with Grudge Rakers are going to be the choice, because they're basically shotgunners, so short range but very powerful missiles, armor piercing, something perhaps akin to Chaos Dwarf blunderbusses, so going to be a very powerful protector of your army. If single entities come charging in, you can keep these more towards the back so they're out the way, and if the strong single entities come charging into your army's formation, you will absolutely lay them out with these boys. And of course, just being ranged, they can do pretty much everything. They can kill lords, heroes, infantry, cavalry, flying units, monsters, whatever. Very powerful, very dangerous. And like most dwarf ranged units, they can survive in melee okay, but they ultimately kinda suck at it. But then there's a Regiment of Renown version of them as well, the Grimdelvers. These are actually not as good in the range department, they still have the short range but less missile strength, but still very strong, just not as strong as the normal version, which might seem weird, right? But they're better in melee. They have Frenzy, which will help them do more damage. They also have Vanguard deployment and Stalk, so they're a bit more of a self-sufficient sneaky unit. Could work well mixed in with the main bulk of your army as a nasty surprise, or they could go off somewhere sneaky with some Bugman's Rangers and be a little flanking party. So still a very dangerous close quarters unit, but just a little more sneaky. And then we have a new artillery piece of sorts, the Goblin Hewer. Now this thing is a little weird. It's kind of an artillery, but also quickly just becomes a Slayer unit. You see, it does a hell of a lot of damage, 3k missile damage, that's huge, but as you can see, it only has 2 ammo. So it's over pretty quick with the ranged attack, and then it just becomes a normal Slayer unit. But with that ranged attack being so strong, it's great for taking down large enemies, especially if you can get the Lord or a strong hero with this. It's going to be worth that money and worth that ammo, because it will absolutely violate them. So a fun little quote-unquote artillery piece to use. It's just over very quick, but if you can save it just for that right moment when the big enemy Lord comes marching over, you can just absolutely ruin his life. Although you could team this up with Malachi and use his ammo replenishment ability, and then hey, there's another 3k damage to use. Tasty. And then last but not least, it's the showstopper, the Thunder Barge, the big old airship for the dwarfs. This thing is permanently flying like the Cathay balloons, has a lot of armor but only 10 melee defense, so you gotta try and keep the melee enemies off of it, the flying ones obviously, but it has a lot of missile strength and it just constantly fires missiles all the time. Its cannons go off, it drops bombs, it just basically does all its damage by itself. You just fly it over where you need it to kill stuff, and it'll do the work for you. It's pretty nice. It is pretty slow at only 30 speed, but it does have an ability that can speed it up drastically, although it does do direct damage to the Thunder Barge itself, so you do have to be careful with it. It also has a magic missile ability, which is basically a massive spear, which is anti-large, so good for sniping down those large enemies. And yeah, as I say, just fly it over the enemies and it will just absolutely go to town on them. a very nice damage-dealing war machine, although it might need some protection from melee enemies if things like dragons or manticores or even harpies come over and start going on it. It's going to take damage pretty quick. So a very fun addition for the dwarves. And there we go, there's the units in the Thrones of Decay DLC. What do you reckon? Let me know down below. Thanks for watching, I hope you've enjoyed this. I will see you in the future.